Maya Carter had just finished a long week at work. She was an FBI agent, one of the best in her department, but today she was just another person running errands. Dressed in jeans and a simple hoodie, she stopped at a small convenience store to grab a few things before heading home. The air was crisp and the streets were quiet. She wasn't thinking about anything except getting a snack and relaxing after a tough week. As she walked out of the store and toward her car, she noticed a police cruiser slowly driving past. She didn't think much of it at first. Police officers patrolled the area all the time. But then, the car stopped. The driver, Officer Brad Thornton, stepped out and called out to her. "Hey, you there?" he said, his voice sharp. Maya turned around, surprised. She pointed to herself, unsure if he was talking to her. "Yes, you," he said, walking toward her. "What are you doing here?" Maya remained calm. "Just buying some snacks," she said, holding up her small bag. Thornton narrowed his eyes, looking her up and down. "You live around here?" he asked. Maya raised an eyebrow. She had heard that question before, and she knew what it meant. Still, she kept her voice steady. "Why are you asking?" Thornton crossed his arms. "Because you look suspicious. I got a report about someone matching your description causing trouble in the area." Maya sighed internally. She had done nothing wrong, but she knew how quickly things like this could escalate. "I just came from that store," she said, nodding toward the convenience shop. "You can check the cameras if you need to." But Thornton wasn't interested in checking. Instead, he took a step closer. "Let me see some ID." Maya hesitated. As an FBI agent, she knew her rights. She also knew that she had done absolutely nothing that required her to show identification. But she also knew how some situations could get out of hand if she wasn't careful. She reached into her pocket for her wallet, moving slowly to avoid any misunderstandings. But before she could pull it out, Thornton's hand was on his radio. "Got a possible suspect refusing to cooperate," he said into his mic. Maya's patience thinned. "I'm not refusing to cooperate," she said firmly. "I'm getting my ID." But Thornton wasn't listening. "Turn around and put your hands where I can see them," he ordered. Maya's heartbeat quickened. She had faced dangerous criminals before, but she never expected to be treated like one herself. "Officer, there's no need for this," she said, still trying to keep the situation calm. "I'm reaching for my—" Before she could finish, Thornton grabbed her arm and turned her around forcefully. "You're under arrest," he said. "For what?" Maya wanted to ask, but she already knew the answer wouldn't make sense. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, she took a deep breath. She had dealt with criminals, spies, and dangerous operations. But now she was facing something different. An injustice that needed to be stopped. Maya sat in the back of the police car, her wrists still in handcuffs. The cold metal pressed against her skin, but she remained calm. She had been in worse situations before, dealing with dangerous criminals and high-risk cases. But this was different. She wasn't being treated like an FBI agent. She wasn't even being treated like a regular citizen. She was being treated like a suspect, all because of one officer's assumptions. The ride to the station was silent. Officer Thornton didn't say much, but every now and then, he glanced at her through the rearview mirror. His expression was one of satisfaction, as if he had just completed an important mission. Maya, however, wasn't worried. She knew the truth, and she knew that the moment she revealed who she was, everything would change. When they arrived at the station, Thornton pulled her out of the car and led her inside. The officers at the front desk looked up as they walked in. Some raised their eyebrows, curious about what was happening. Others smirked, exchanging amused glances as if they had seen this situation before. "Got another one," Thornton said proudly, pushing Maya forward. One of the officers, a man with graying hair and a tired expression, looked at her. "What's the charge?" he asked. Thornton hesitated for a second. "Suspicious behavior," he said quickly, resisting too. Maya wanted to laugh at the ridiculousness of it all, but she kept her face neutral. Instead, she simply shook her head. "I didn't resist," she said calmly. "I was getting my ID when he decided to arrest me." The older officer looked between her and Thornton, as if trying to decide who to believe. But in the end, he simply shrugged and started filling out paperwork. "Take her to holding," he said. Thornton grabbed Maya's arm again, leading her toward the back of the station. The other officers watched with interest. Some whispered, but no one questioned what was happening. As Maya stepped into the holding area, she saw a few people sitting on benches, waiting for their fate. Some looked tired, others angry. She simply took a deep breath and sat down, her mind already forming a plan. Thornton stood by the door, arms crossed. "Bet you weren't expecting this today, huh?" he said with a smirk. Maya met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You're right," she said. "I wasn't." He chuckled. "Better get comfortable." Maya didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because in just a little while, everything was going to change. She just had to wait. Maya sat in a holding cell, her hands resting on her lap. The cold air inside the station made her shiver slightly. But she wasn't worried. She had been through worse situations before, and this wasn't going to shake her. She watched as officers moved around outside the cell, laughing, talking, and acting like this was just another normal day. For them, it probably was, but they had no idea what was about to happen. After what felt like an hour, an officer walked toward her with a clipboard. He looked at her, then at the paper in his hands. "All right, time to process you," he said casually. "Let's start with your name." Maya leaned back slightly. She had been waiting for this moment. She had allowed them to go this far without revealing who she was, but now it was time to change the game. She looked directly at the officer and spoke clearly. "Special Agent Maya Carter." The officer frowned. "What?" Maya remained calm. "I'm an FBI agent," she said, "and you just arrested me without cause." The room fell silent. A few nearby officers turned their heads, suddenly paying attention. The officer holding the clipboard blinked, clearly confused. "What kind of joke is this?" Thornton said, stepping forward with a smirk. "You're no FBI agent." Maya sighed and tilted her head slightly. "You have my belongings, right? Why don't you check my ID?" Thornton hesitated for a second before turning to another officer. "Go get her stuff," he ordered. The officer rushed off, and within moments he returned, holding Maya's wallet. He opened it and pulled out a badge. A real, official FBI badge. The golden emblem shone under the station's bright lights. The room, once filled with laughter and chatter, was now completely silent. One of the senior officers, who had been watching from his desk, suddenly stood up and walked over. His face was pale. He took the badge from the officer's hands and examined it closely. Then he looked at Maya with wide eyes. "Agent Carter," he muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. Maya gave a small nod. "That's right." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Officers who had been watching for entertainment now looked uncomfortable. Some whispered to each other. Others stared at Thornton, who had taken a step back, his face turning red. The senior officer turned to Thornton. "You arrested an FBI agent?" he asked, his voice sharp. Thornton swallowed hard, but quickly tried to act like it wasn't a big deal. "She was acting suspicious," he said, though his confidence had clearly disappeared. The senior officer wasn't convinced. He turned back to Maya. "I'm so sorry about this," he said. "We'll fix this right away." Maya gave a small smile, but didn't say anything yet. She knew this wasn't over. Not even close. She watched as Thornton's world began to crumble. And she knew this was just the beginning. Thornton stood frozen, his face pale as the weight of his mistake settled in. The room, once filled with whispers and quiet laughter, now felt heavy with silence. Every officer in the station was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The senior officer, Captain Reynolds, held Maya's FBI badge in his hands, his expression filled with disbelief. He turned toward Thornton, his voice sharp. "You arrested an FBI agent. Without reason." Thornton cleared his throat and tried to stand tall. "She was acting suspicious," he repeated, though his voice was weaker now. "I was just doing my job." Maya finally stood up, the handcuffs still on her wrists. She remained calm, but her eyes were focused, sharp. "Your job?" she asked. "Your job is to serve and protect. But you didn't ask questions. You didn't check the facts. You saw me and assumed I was a suspect." Thornton opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say anything, Captain Reynolds raised a hand, silencing him. The captain turned to another officer. "Get those cuffs off her. Now." The officer rushed forward, fumbling slightly as he unlocked the cuffs. The moment Maya's wrists were free, she rolled them slightly, easing the stiffness. She had remained patient throughout the entire process, but now it was time for answers. She took a step closer to Thornton, her voice steady. "Tell me, Officer Thornton," she said, "did you run my name through the system before arresting me?" Thornton's jaw clenched. He didn't answer. Maya nodded, already knowing the truth. "Did you ask the store owner if I had done anything wrong?" Again, silence. She turned to Captain Reynolds. "I'd like to see the report he wrote on my arrest." Reynolds glanced at Thornton, who looked even more uncomfortable. "There isn't one," he admitted after a moment. Maya crossed her arms. "So let me get this straight," she said. "I was arrested, brought to this station, and placed in a holding cell without any official record. No charges, no paperwork." More silence. Maya looked around the room, making eye contact with the other officers. Some shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. Others looked genuinely ashamed. She could feel the tension growing, but she wasn't done yet. "You thought you could get away with it," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Because you've done it before, haven't you?" Thornton finally snapped. "Look, I made a mistake, all right. I didn't know who you were." Maya tilted her head. "And if I wasn't an FBI agent?" she asked. "What would have happened to me then?" Thornton had no answer. The room remained silent. Captain Reynolds took a deep breath, his face serious. "Agent Carter, I assure you, this will be handled immediately." Maya studied his face, deciding whether to believe him. She wasn't just going to let this go. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about justice. And this was far from over. Maya stood in the middle of the station, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air. Officer Thornton, who had been so confident earlier, now looked tense and uneasy. Captain Reynolds still held her FBI badge, his expression serious. Maya took a slow breath, keeping her voice calm. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about how many others have been treated the same way." Captain Reynolds gave a small nod. "I understand, Agent Carter," he said. "There will be an internal review." Maya's sharp eyes met his. "An internal review," she repeated. "That's not enough. This isn't just a simple mistake. This is a pattern." Several officers shifted uncomfortably. No one wanted to say it, but they all knew the truth. Thornton had been at the department for years. This wasn't the first time he had arrested someone without cause. It was just the first time he had done it to the wrong person. Maya turned to face Thornton. "How many others have you done this to?" she asked. Thornton crossed his arms. "I don't have to answer that," he muttered. Maya wasn't surprised by his reaction. She looked back at Captain Reynolds. "I want to file a formal complaint," she said. "And I want a full investigation into Officer Thornton's arrest history." Reynolds hesitated, but he knew he had no choice. "I'll start the process," he said. "But these things take time." Maya nodded, already expecting resistance. "That's fine," she said, "because I'm not leaving this alone." Just then, the door to the station burst open. Several men in suits walked in. FBI officials. The room, already tense, became even more silent. One of them, a tall man with sharp features, walked straight to Captain Reynolds. "We need to have a conversation," he said firmly. "Now." Thornton's face lost all color. He took a small step back, as if trying to disappear. Maya watched as the FBI officials spoke quietly with the captain, their voices low but serious. She had made one phone call, and now the entire situation had escalated. This wasn't just a local police matter anymore. The FBI was involved. A younger officer, who had been watching everything from his desk, suddenly spoke. "I always thought something was off," he said quietly. "Thornton brought people in all the time, but half the time, there weren't even real charges." Maya turned to him. "Then now's the time to speak up," she said. The officer hesitated but then gave a small nod. "Yeah, it is." She knew this was just the beginning. The truth was coming out, and no one would be able to ignore it. Thornton had been so sure he had control, but now he was realizing the truth. This time, he was the one under investigation. The station had never been this silent before. Officers who were once laughing and chatting now stood frozen, watching as the FBI agents spoke with Captain Reynolds in low but firm voices. Maya stood calmly, her presence unshaken. She had faced intense situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just about an arrest. This was about exposing the truth. Thornton's confidence had completely disappeared. He stood stiffly near his desk, his hands clenched into fists. Every few seconds, his eyes darted toward the FBI agents, as if looking for an escape. But there was none. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. One of the FBI officials, Agent Collins, finally turned toward Thornton. His sharp gaze locked onto the officer. "Officer Thornton, we need to have a conversation," he said, his voice steady but filled with authority. Thornton swallowed hard. "I don't understand what the big deal is," he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "I made a mistake, that's all." Collins didn't react to the excuse. Instead, he pulled out a file and opened it. "A mistake," he repeated. "We've been looking into your arrest history, Officer Thornton. And do you know what we found?" The room grew even quieter. Maya crossed her arms and waited. Collins continued, flipping through the pages. "Over the past 5 years, you've arrested dozens of people without filing proper charges. In some cases, you didn't even write reports." He looked up. "Why is that, officer?" Thornton's face turned red. "Those people were acting suspicious," he said quickly. "I was doing my job." Collins raised a hand, cutting him off. "Your job is to enforce the law, not to make assumptions," he said firmly. "And according to this, at least half of your arrests were dismissed due to lack of evidence. Some of these individuals even filed complaints against you." Maya studied Thornton's reaction carefully. His breathing had become uneven, and he looked like he wanted to argue, but he couldn't. The evidence was there. Captain Reynolds let out a deep sigh, rubbing his temples. "This is serious, Thornton," he said. "I can't protect you from this." Thornton turned to him, desperation creeping into his voice. "Captain, you know me. I was just doing what I thought was right." Maya finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "You thought what was right was arresting people without reason?" she asked. "Because when you arrested me, you didn't check my ID. You didn't ask questions. You just assumed." Thornton had no response. Collins shut the file and looked at the captain. "He needs to be placed on leave immediately," he said, "while we continue our investigation." Captain Reynolds nodded, his face grim. "Officer Thornton, turn in your badge and gun," he said. Thornton's eyes widened. "Wait. That's an order," Reynolds said firmly. With shaky hands, Thornton reached for his badge. His world was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Maya watched, knowing justice was finally being served. Thornton's hand shook as he unpinned his badge from his uniform. The once proud officer, who had walked into the station with arrogance, now looked small and uncertain. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers gripping the metal tightly, as if refusing to let go. But there was no way out. With a deep breath, He finally placed the badge on Captain Reynolds' desk. The room remained silent as every officer watched. Some had expressions of shock, others of quiet understanding. It was clear that many had suspected this moment would come, but no one had ever spoken up. Now, there was no hiding. The truth had caught up to Thornton. "Your gun," Captain Reynolds reminded him, his voice firm, but emotionless. Thornton swallowed hard, then reached down to unclip his holster. Slowly, he placed his service weapon next to his badge. His shoulders slumped, as if the weight of reality had just crashed down on him. Collins nodded at Reynolds. "He'll be escorted out," he said. "The investigation will continue, and if further evidence is found, charges may follow." Thornton's head snapped up. "Charges," he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "For what? I didn't do anything illegal." Maya finally stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "You abused your power," she said. "You arrested people without cause. You violated their rights. And now you have to face the consequences." Thornton let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, come on. This is just about one arrest." Maya shook her head. "No," she said. "It's about every single person you treated unfairly. It's about the people who didn't have an FBI badge to protect them." Thornton opened his mouth to argue, but the look on Captain Reynolds' face told him it was pointless. He had lost. 2 officers stepped forward to escort him out. As they reached for his arm, he pulled away angrily. "I can walk on my own," he muttered. No one stopped him. The station remained silent as he walked toward the exit, his footsteps heavy. Just as he reached the door, he turned back, his eyes filled with frustration. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "I was just doing my job." Maya met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "No," she said. "You were doing what you thought you could get away with." Thornton stared at her for a moment, then scoffed before pushing the door open and stepping out. The second he was gone, a breath of relief passed through the station. Officers exchanged glances, some whispering to each other. The tension that had filled the room finally started to ease. Captain Reynolds turned to Maya. "Agent Carter, I want to personally apologize for what happened today," he said sincerely. "And I promise we will be making changes." Maya nodded. "I'll be watching," she said. She knew the battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, real change had begun. A week had passed since the incident at the police station, but its effects were still being felt. News had spread quickly about Officer Thornton's suspension, and an official investigation into his past arrests was now in full motion. The department was under pressure, and officers who had once ignored his actions were now forced to speak up. Maya sat in her office at the FBI headquarters, reviewing reports. She had received multiple messages from people who had been wrongfully arrested by Thornton in the past. Some had filed complaints that were ignored, while others had simply accepted their fate, believing nothing could be done. But now, everything had changed. Her phone rang, and she picked it up. It was Captain Reynolds. "Agent Carter," he said, his voice calmer than it had been before. "I wanted to update you on our internal review." Maya leaned back in her chair. "I'm listening." Reynolds sighed. "We found multiple cases where Officer Thornton made arrests without proper justification. In some instances, there were no reports at all. It's worse than we initially thought." Maya wasn't surprised. "And what happens now?" "We're moving forward with disciplinary action," Reynolds said. "Not just against Thornton, but against anyone who covered for him. We can't allow this kind of behavior to continue." Maya appreciated his words, but she knew that promises were easy to make. "I hope you mean that," she said, "because I'll be making sure those changes actually happen." There was a brief pause before Reynolds spoke again. "I believe you," he said. "And I want to thank you. You could have walked away, but you didn't." Maya nodded, though he couldn't see her. "I couldn't walk away," she said, "because this isn't just about me. It's about doing what's right." After ending the call, Maya looked at the files spread across her desk. She knew this was just one case in a much bigger issue. There were many others like Thornton, officers who abused their power, believing no one would hold them accountable. But things were changing. People were speaking up. And as long as she had the power to do something, she wasn't going to stop. Later that evening, Maya walked through the city, reflecting on everything that had happened. The night air was cool, and the streets were alive with people going about their lives. She passed by a small cafe where a young man recognized her. "Agent Carter," he said, approaching hesitantly. She stopped and gave a small smile. "That's me. I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "A few years ago, Thornton arrested me for no reason. I tried to fight it, but no one listened. Seeing what happened, it gives me hope." Maya nodded. "Justice takes time," she said, "but it always catches up." As she walked away, she felt a sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about making sure no one else suffered the same injustice, and as long as she had a voice, she would continue to use it.